Imagine a city where the streets themselves seemed to whisper warnings, where everyday life was shadowed by the presence of figures whose reputations alone could stop conversations and turn neighborhoods into zones of quiet caution. Dublin, a city known for its vibrant culture and rich history, also harbored an underworld where fear and influence moved hand in hand. The 45 minutes you are about to explore reveal a world dominated by Irish gangsters who did not just commit crimes, they shaped the very rhythm of daily life, dictating who could move freely, who would be watched, and which areas were off-limits. These were individuals whose strategies were calculated, their reputations meticulously built, and their reach extended across districts like Drogheda, Finglas, and Drimnagh. Understanding their rise requires looking beyond headlines and police reports to the social, economic, and political currents that allowed such figures to gain footholds in communities. The gangs were often deeply enmeshed in local society, recruiting members from families, neighborhoods, and social circles, and cultivating a blend of loyalty and fear that allowed them to operate with near impunity. They were not merely violent actors, they were organizers, strategists, and in some cases, business-minded opportunists who leveraged legitimate enterprises to mask or supplement their activities. Dublin's urban geography, with its tightly knit communities and complex networks of streets and alleyways, became both a playground and a battlefield, shaping how gangs interacted, how rivalries escalated, and how authority, both formal and informal, was contested. Intelligence about rival groups, territorial boundaries, and local loyalties became a currency as valuable as cash, weapons, or influence, and the most successful gangsters were those who could navigate this intricate web with foresight and adaptability. Law enforcement, community leaders, and even ordinary residents were constantly forced to readjust their expectations and routines in response to the shifting dynamics of these gangs. What set Dublin's underworld apart was not merely the scale of criminal activity, but the subtle ways in which these figures penetrated everyday life. Control was as much psychological as physical, achieved through reputation, communication, and strategic displays of influence. Even in areas untouched by direct violence, the knowledge of who ruled the underworld dictated behavior, shaped interactions, and influenced local economies. This landscape was further complicated by the interconnectedness of rival groups. Territorial disputes were frequent, but alliances, temporary truces, and negotiations also played a role, creating a constantly evolving network of power and influence. The gang's ability to adapt to law enforcement strategies, exploit social networks, and maintain internal cohesion contributed to their resilience and allowed them to dominate the city for extended periods. Dublin's gangsters also understood the media's power and the way public perception could amplify influence. Stories, rumors, and reputation often preceded direct action, shaping fear and respect across communities. In essence, the control these figures exerted was a combination of strategic action, social awareness, and psychological insight. Understanding their rise offers insight into the mechanics of urban crime, the interplay of fear and loyalty, and the ways in which individuals can leverage social, economic, and cultural factors to consolidate power. The stories that follow illustrate not just criminal activity, but also the broader social dynamics that allowed these individuals to emerge, persist, and ultimately shape the city in ways that still resonate today. By examining their methods, networks, and strategies, we gain a deeper understanding of how organized crime operates in an urban setting, and how communities navigate the presence of influence that operates in the shadows. These 45 minutes provide more than a chronology of events. They offer a lens into the lived realities of Dublin's residents during a period dominated by gang influence, and into the systems of control, loyalty, and negotiation that defined the city's underworld. The lives of these gangsters, the neighborhoods they controlled, and the societal responses they provoked demonstrate a complex interplay of human ambition, social dynamics, and the mechanisms of power. They remind us that criminal activity is rarely isolated from the context in which it occurs, and that understanding that context is essential to comprehending both the rise and eventual decline of such figures. The narrative also highlights the resilience of communities, the persistence of law enforcement efforts, and the ongoing impact that this era of gang dominance has on Dublin today. By tracing these developments carefully, we can see how influence, fear, and strategy combine to create environments in which power is both maintained and contested, and how individuals navigate the fine line between control and vulnerability in a city that was, for decades, under the shadow of its most notorious figures. The dominance of Dublin's gangsters was not solely a matter of brute force. It was rooted in the way these organizations structured themselves, developed networks, and maintained control over both people and territory. Following the rise of the first wave of figures who instilled fear in neighborhoods, rivalries began to emerge, each fueled by ambition, strategic missteps, and the natural tensions that arise when multiple actors vie for dominance within a single urban space. The gang's internal hierarchies were often complex, with leaders relying on lieutenants and trusted associates to manage day-to-day operations, enforce rules, and communicate directives. These structures allowed them to exert influence even when the leaders were absent or under scrutiny by law enforcement. Dublin's geography played a crucial role in shaping these rivalries. Districts such as Drogheda, Finglas, and Drimnagh were not just locations on a map, they were strategic assets. Control over a neighborhood meant control over businesses, revenue streams, social influence, and the ability to recruit new members. Rival gangs were constantly assessing the balance of power, seeking opportunities to encroach on territory, undermine authority, or exploit weaknesses. Intelligence gathering became an essential part of gang operations. Understanding rival movements, alliances, and internal vulnerabilities allowed leaders to anticipate threats and maintain an upper hand. This intelligence was often gathered through informal networks, community connections, and even opportunistic observation. The most effective leaders were those who could synthesize this information quickly and act decisively, ensuring that rival factions were constantly aware of their strength and reach. Alliances and temporary truces were another important aspect of maintaining influence. While conflicts were common, pragmatic leaders recognized the value of negotiation, leveraging agreements to consolidate power or to prepare for future strategic moves. These arrangements were delicate, often fragile, and could dissolve at any moment, leading to sudden escalations in violence or territorial disputes. The psychological dimension of these rivalries was also significant. Leaders understood that perception often mattered more than reality. The ability to cultivate an image of invincibility, to project control over territory, and to demonstrate loyalty among members was as crucial as any physical enforcement of authority. Community perception was central to sustaining dominance, as fear, respect, and obedience could be maintained without direct confrontation if the narrative of control was persuasive enough. At the same time, law enforcement and public scrutiny added pressure to these dynamics. Police operations, surveillance, and investigative efforts created an environment in which the gangs had to constantly adapt their strategies. Leaders became adept at operating under scrutiny, using misdirection, compartmentalization, and selective engagement to minimize exposure while maintaining operational effectiveness. Economic control was a vital element of rivalry. Dublin gangs understood that money was power, and they often invested in both legitimate and illicit enterprises to fund operations, reward loyalty, and expand influence. From small local businesses to more substantial ventures, these revenue streams allowed leaders to reinforce authority, maintain networks, and project strength. Rivalries often intersected with broader social and political contexts, shaping how communities, media, and political figures responded to gang activity. High-profile disputes could draw public attention, influence policy decisions, or even shift law enforcement priorities. Leaders had to be aware not only of their internal organization and immediate competitors, but also of how external actors might perceive and react to their actions. Recruitment and internal discipline were critical in sustaining dominance during rivalries. Leaders carefully selected members who could be trusted to carry out tasks effectively, maintain secrecy, and contribute to the organization's goals. Training, mentorship, and internal messaging reinforced cohesion, ensuring that members understood both their responsibilities and the consequences of disloyalty. Rivalries also generated innovation in tactics and strategy. As factions sought to gain advantage, they experimented with new methods of communication, concealment, and negotiation. These innovations were often responses to both external pressures and internal competition, reflecting the adaptive nature of these organizations in a complex urban environment. Community impact remained central. Residents lived under the constant awareness of shifting power dynamics, adjusting their behavior, alliances, and interactions in response to changes in gang control. This created a pervasive atmosphere in which influence extended beyond direct criminal activity, shaping social norms, economic patterns, and even the psychological landscape of neighborhoods. Over time, the cumulative effect of rivalries contributed to the evolution of Dublin's criminal landscape. Some factions were weakened or absorbed, while others grew stronger, creating a constantly changing hierarchy of power and influence. Leaders who could navigate these shifts successfully consolidated long-term authority, while those who miscalculated faced exposure, displacement, or elimination from the urban power structure. The interplay of strategy, perception, and adaptability defines the nature of gang rivalries in Dublin. Leaders who combined these elements effectively could maintain dominance despite challenges, while their rivals struggled to keep pace in a high-stakes environment where decisions carried immediate and long-term consequences. The stories of these rivalries illustrate more than mere conflict. They reveal the mechanisms through which urban gangs operate, maintain control, and adapt to complex and dynamic social, economic, and political pressures. Understanding these dynamics provides insight into the resilience of organized crime, the vulnerabilities of leadership, and the ways in which power is negotiated and contested in densely populated urban settings. By examining the rise, conflicts, and strategic decisions of Dublin's gangs, we gain a deeper appreciation of the intricate systems that underlie organized crime, as well as the enduring consequences for communities, law enforcement, and the broader social fabric. The rivalries, strategies, and outcomes collectively paint a portrait of an underworld where influence, reputation, and tactical intelligence are just as important as raw force, and where leadership depends on the ability to anticipate, adapt, and assert authority in an environment defined by constant change and uncertainty.
The operations of Dublin's gangs extended far beyond the immediate clashes between rival factions, revealing a sophisticated network of activities designed to maximize influence, control, and revenue while minimizing risk. Following the rivalries that shaped the city's territorial boundaries, leaders began to diversify their operations, combining traditional criminal enterprises with more subtle methods of social and economic leverage. Drug trafficking, extortion, and protection rackets were often the most visible elements of their influence, but these activities were supported by an intricate system of legitimate businesses, financial arrangements, and community connections. These complementary enterprises allowed gang leaders to launder money, maintain appearances of legitimacy, and secure resources to reward loyal members. Strategic use of property, both residential and commercial, became a key factor in sustaining operations. Control over rental units, businesses, and storage spaces not only generated income, but also provided logistical support, safe houses, and meeting points that were essential for coordinating activities. Leaders understood that securing physical assets strengthened both economic and symbolic power, signaling to rivals and community members alike that their organization was firmly established. Communication networks were equally critical, from informal neighborhood messengers to more sophisticated methods of coded exchanges. Gangs ensured that information flowed efficiently while minimizing exposure to law enforcement surveillance. This allowed leaders to maintain situational awareness, coordinate complex operations, and respond rapidly to emerging threats or opportunities. The role of community integration cannot be overstated. Dublin's gangsters were often embedded within the neighborhoods they controlled, creating relationships that blended loyalty, fear, and interdependence. Residents might rely on gang-provided protection, access to resources, or even employment opportunities, creating a dynamic in which the organization's influence extended into social and economic spheres. This integration also complicated law enforcement efforts, as distinguishing between criminal actors and ordinary residents became a nuanced challenge. Leadership strategy often included a careful balance of intimidation and benevolence. Public displays of power reinforced authority, while acts of patronage or support fostered loyalty and mitigated dissent. Leaders understood that influence was maintained not solely through coercion, but through the ability to cultivate dependence, respect, and recognition of the organization's capacity to shape outcomes. Recruitment and training were fundamental to operational success. Leaders identified potential members based on trustworthiness, skill sets, and the ability to navigate the organization's internal culture. Mentorship, testing of loyalty, and gradual integration ensured that new members contributed effectively, while internal cohesion remained strong. This process also reinforced the hierarchical nature of the organization, with clear lines of authority and responsibility that allowed for efficient decision-making even in high-pressure situations. Financial management was a sophisticated component of operations. Beyond direct criminal earnings, gangs invested in schemes that could generate long-term revenue and reduce exposure to law enforcement scrutiny. Offshore accounts, property holdings, and covert business arrangements provided both a safety net and a means to exert influence over local economies. Leaders who mastered financial strategy could sustain operations over long periods, even amid external pressures. Interaction with rival factions and external actors required a strategic blend of diplomacy and aggression. Negotiating temporary truces, managing conflicts, and leveraging alliances allowed leaders to navigate a complex landscape in which power was fluid and constantly contested. These interactions were often underpinned by intelligence gathering, careful assessment of risks, and anticipation of both direct and indirect consequences. Law enforcement interventions, media attention, and public scrutiny were ongoing challenges. Leaders adapted by compartmentalizing operations, minimizing exposure, and employing misdirection to protect critical aspects of their networks. Awareness of regulatory, legal, and social pressures informed strategic choices, illustrating the multidimensional nature of leadership in these environments. The psychological dimension of operations remained central. Leaders leveraged reputation, perception, and narrative to influence behavior, both within the gang and across the community. Fear was a tool, but so was credibility and the perception of competence. Ensuring that members and rivals recognized the organization's capabilities was essential to sustaining authority and deterring challenges. As these operations evolved, the impact on communities became increasingly apparent. The presence of gangs influenced social norms, economic opportunities, and neighborhood dynamics. Residents adapted to the realities of control, often navigating complex relationships between dependence, fear, and resistance.
The long-term consequences of gang activity included shifts in community cohesion, patterns of trust and suspicion, and the shaping of urban life in ways that persisted even after individual leaders were removed from power. The combination of territorial control, diversified operations, strategic communication, financial acumen, and community integration illustrates the sophisticated nature of Dublin's gang networks. Understanding these mechanisms sheds light on how influence was maintained, how rivalries were managed, and how power persisted even in the face of law enforcement and social challenges. Ultimately, the operations of these gangs reveal a delicate balance between opportunity and risk, authority and vulnerability, coercion and influence. Leaders who successfully navigated this landscape could exert control over neighborhoods, resources, and social dynamics, creating a structured yet adaptable network capable of enduring challenges and asserting dominance. These operational strategies demonstrate that organized crime is not merely a collection of individual acts, but a complex system in which leadership, logistics, psychology, and community relations interact to sustain influence over time. By examining these operations, we gain insight into the mechanisms that allowed Dublin's gangs to shape the city's social, economic, and spatial dynamics, highlighting both the sophistication of criminal networks and the challenges inherent in countering them. The stories emerging from these operations provide a window into the interplay of power, strategy, and adaptation, illustrating how influence is both constructed and maintained in environments defined by uncertainty, competition, and high stakes.
The impact of Dublin's gang activities extended far beyond the direct operations and rivalries of the organizations themselves, seeping into every aspect of community life, law enforcement priorities, and the city's social fabric. As these gangs solidified their influence through territorial control, financial operations, and social integration, their presence forced communities to adjust, adapt, and navigate a complex set of risks and expectations. Ordinary residents, business owners, and local institutions quickly learned that the decisions of gang leaders could affect their daily routines, economic opportunities, and personal safety. The subtle ways in which control was exercised, through reputation, selective enforcement of rules, and strategic visibility, meant that even those who had no direct involvement with criminal activity were nevertheless influenced by the gang's presence. For law enforcement, this environment presented a particularly difficult challenge. Traditional policing methods were often insufficient to counteract the multifaceted and deeply embedded nature of these organizations. Officers had to contend not only with the overt criminal acts, but also with the less visible mechanisms of influence, including community loyalty to gang members, the intimidation of witnesses, and the strategic compartmentalization of operations. Investigations required patience, intelligence gathering, and innovative strategies to understand both the structure of the organizations and the social dynamics that allowed them to persist. The gang's ability to exploit the gray areas between legal and illegal activity further complicated enforcement efforts. Many organizations invested in legitimate enterprises, creating a dual structure in which law-abiding business operations masked illicit activities. This allowed gang leaders to maintain an appearance of legitimacy while simultaneously funding operations, rewarding loyal members, and asserting influence in neighborhoods. For communities, the presence of these dual structures produced a complex social reality. Residents were often caught between fear, dependency, and pragmatism. Some relied on gang-provided protection or access to resources, while others carefully maintained distance to avoid conflict. Social norms, economic behaviors, and even patterns of mobility within neighborhoods were influenced by the underlying threat of intervention or oversight from gang leaders. Education and youth engagement were not immune to these dynamics. Young people growing up in neighborhoods dominated by gangs were exposed to narratives of loyalty, power, and survival that could shape their perceptions of authority, risk, and opportunity. Recruitment efforts by gangs often targeted those who were most vulnerable or impressionable, drawing them into systems of influence through mentorship, incentives, or the demonstration of status and prestige. Media and public perception played an additional role in the gang's impact on society. Stories about violent clashes, arrests, and territorial disputes circulated widely, amplifying the psychological reach of these organizations. Even residents removed from direct engagement were influenced by the portrayal of gang power in newspapers, television reports, and social conversation. This amplification reinforced the perception of omnipotence, contributing to a culture in which fear and respect coexisted as tools of social control. The economic consequences of gang activity were also profound. Small businesses, property values, and local economies were affected by the presence of gangs, who could exert influence over which enterprises succeeded, which contracts were awarded, and how resources were distributed. This economic leverage was another avenue through which gangs maintained dominance, extending their control beyond mere physical presence to encompass financial and social influence. Over time, the cumulative effect of these impacts shaped the city's urban landscape and social networks. Neighborhoods became associated with particular factions, creating informal boundaries that affected everything from travel patterns to business opportunities. Social cohesion within communities was influenced by the need to navigate relationships with powerful local actors, creating a complex web of trust, suspicion, and strategic alignment. Law enforcement agencies, policymakers, and social workers began to recognize the necessity of holistic approaches that accounted not only for the immediate criminal acts, but also for the broader societal effects of gang dominance. Community engagement, intelligence sharing, and targeted social programs became essential components of mitigating influence and restoring stability in areas long affected by gang operations. The legacy of these gangs persists in both tangible and intangible ways. Physical infrastructure, business patterns, and neighborhood hierarchies bear traces of past dominance, while collective memory, social norms, and public perceptions continue to reflect the long-term influence of these organizations. Understanding this legacy is essential for contextualizing contemporary urban challenges and developing effective strategies for crime prevention, community resilience, and social development. In reflecting on the broader impact, it becomes clear that Dublin's gangs were not merely criminal entities, but complex social actors whose actions shaped behavior, economic systems, and public perception. The interplay between operational strategy, territorial control, social integration, and psychological influence created a self-reinforcing system that extended far beyond the immediate activities of any single faction. The enduring lessons from this period emphasize the importance of considering the full spectrum of influence exerted by organized crime, from the visible acts of lawbreaking to the subtler mechanisms of social and economic control. By examining these dynamics, we gain insight into how communities, institutions, and individuals navigate the pressures imposed by powerful actors operating in the shadows, and how strategies of resilience, adaptation, and enforcement intersect to shape the urban experience. Ultimately, the story of Dublin's gangs demonstrates that the impact of organized crime is not confined to criminal activity alone. It encompasses the ways in which power, perception, and social structures interact to create environments that demand constant vigilance, strategic thinking, and collective adaptation. The complex legacy of these organizations continues to inform discussions about urban governance, law enforcement strategy, community engagement, and the enduring challenges of managing influence in densely interconnected social systems. Understanding these impacts allows for a more nuanced perspective on both historical events and contemporary efforts to reduce the reach of organized crime, providing a framework for analyzing the interplay between power, society, and institutional response in modern cities.
The enduring legacy of Dublin's gang era is not measured solely by arrests, convictions, or territorial shifts, but by the profound and lasting imprint left on the city's social, economic, and cultural fabric. Even after the decline or dismantling of key factions, the influence of these organizations persisted, subtly shaping behaviors, expectations, and community dynamics. Residents who grew up under the shadow of gang activity carried forward lessons of caution, awareness, and strategic navigation of social networks, often internalizing complex hierarchies and power structures that influenced interactions well beyond the neighborhoods directly affected. Former gang members, too, played a role in this legacy, either by reintegrating into society, mentoring younger individuals, or maintaining connections that carried residual influence. The psychological imprint on communities was profound, as fear, respect, and negotiation became embedded in the collective consciousness, influencing everything from personal choices to business dealings. Economically, the long-term effects of gang dominance were equally significant. Local markets, property values, and small business operations had been shaped for decades by the presence of organized crime, creating a pattern of dependency, opportunity, and risk management that did not vanish overnight. Entrepreneurs and residents adapted to these conditions, learning to navigate challenges, avoid conflicts, and leverage opportunities within an environment previously controlled or influenced by gangs. Law enforcement and public institutions also evolved in response to this enduring influence. Agencies recognized that addressing the remnants of organized crime required not just reactive policing, but proactive engagement, community support, and long-term strategic planning. Programs aimed at youth outreach, community building, and economic development were implemented to counteract the lingering effects of fear, influence, and restricted opportunity. These efforts highlighted the interconnectedness of criminal influence, social cohesion, and institutional response, demonstrating that dismantling an organization does not immediately erase its impact. Culturally, the stories of Dublin's gangs entered local narratives, folklore, and media portrayals, shaping public perception of neighborhoods, safety, and identity. Documentaries, news reports, and personal accounts chronicled the era, creating a shared understanding of both the dangers and the resilience inherent in communities affected by gang activity. These narratives continue to inform how residents, policymakers, and outsiders view the city, embedding lessons about power, negotiation, and the consequences of unchecked influence. Importantly, the legacy also included lessons in adaptability, strategy, and resilience. Individuals and communities learned to read social cues, anticipate shifts in power, and navigate environments where influence and authority were contested. These skills, forged under challenging circumstances, became part of the social fabric, influencing interactions long after the direct threat had diminished. Former leaders and members of gangs left behind networks of loyalty, reputation, and institutional knowledge that could be mobilized for both constructive and destructive purposes. The presence of these residual networks required continued attention from law enforcement, social workers, and policymakers, as even dormant or fragmented factions could re-emerge under favorable conditions. The educational aspect of this legacy is also noteworthy. By studying the strategies, hierarchies, and operations of Dublin's gangs, communities, scholars, and authorities gained a deeper understanding of organized crime as a system rather than isolated acts. This knowledge informed approaches to crime prevention, urban planning, social support, and policing strategies, emphasizing the need to address underlying social and economic factors alongside immediate enforcement. The interplay between historical influence and contemporary challenges created a cityscape where the lessons of the past were in constant dialogue with the realities of the present. Understanding the enduring effects of gang dominance allows for more effective strategies to promote safety, social cohesion, and economic opportunity, recognizing that the impact of organized crime is multidimensional and long-lasting. Socially, the era left behind a nuanced understanding of trust, loyalty, and risk management within communities. Individuals learned to navigate complex social networks, balancing relationships with former gang affiliates, law enforcement, and neighbors. This delicate negotiation of influence, respect, and caution continues to shape the behavior and decision-making of residents, reflecting the subtle but persistent power of past criminal networks. The media's role in perpetuating and examining the legacy is significant as well. Documentaries, investigative journalism, and community storytelling continue to provide insight into the mechanisms of gang influence, ensuring that the lessons of history remain accessible and informative. These narratives help communities process past trauma, understand the complexity of social dynamics, and develop strategies to mitigate the long-term effects of criminal dominance. Overarching all of this is the recognition that power, influence, and social control are not easily erased. The structures, relationships, and behaviors established during periods of gang dominance persist, evolving to meet contemporary circumstances. This underscores the importance of comprehensive approaches that combine law enforcement, social policy, education, and community engagement to address the multidimensional legacy of organized crime. Ultimately, the story of Dublin's gang era demonstrates that the consequences of organized crime extend far beyond immediate acts of criminality. The legacy encompasses social adaptation, economic impact, cultural memory, psychological imprint, and institutional response. By examining these dimensions, we gain a holistic understanding of how communities navigate environments shaped by power, influence, and competition, and how the lessons of history can inform contemporary strategies to foster resilience, opportunity, and safety. The narrative also reinforces the notion that organized crime is a system embedded within social, economic, and cultural networks whose effects are both pervasive and enduring. Recognizing and addressing these effects requires sustained effort, strategic planning, and a commitment to understanding the intricate interplay between authority, influence, and community response. As Dublin continues to evolve, the legacy of its gang era remains a lens through which the city can understand both past challenges and present opportunities, offering insights into resilience, adaptation, and the ongoing negotiation of power within urban environments. Ultimately, the story provides a roadmap for understanding not just crime, but the broader mechanisms of influence, control, and social navigation that define human interaction in complex, high-stakes environments. And it reminds us that history's lessons are essential to shaping a safer, more informed future for communities everywhere.